We can't have an economy without infrastructure that works. We can't expect the economy to work for our kids and grandkids when they come of age if we leave them cities and communities that are broken, that don't function. And as difficult as it may be sometimes for us to imagine deficit spending and increasing the national deficit, just imagine the cost it would be if we didn't invest in this infrastructure, if we allowed it to fail.
I'm John Lewis, and you're listening to 360 Degree City, a podcast where we talk to all kinds of folks that are making life in cities better. Our hope is at the end of each episode, you'll start to see your own city from a slightly different angle. How we build our cities is always going to be intertwined with politics. This episode is the second of two episodes where I talk to urbanists who have become politicians. In the last episode, I talked to Jyoti Gondek, a city councillor in Calgary, about what it's like to be an urbanist turned politician at the municipal scale. Today, I'm talking to Andy Fillmore, a member of parliament, about what it's like to be an urbanist turned politician at the national scale.
My name is Andy Fillmore. First and foremost, I'm a city planner and have been for coming on 25 years. 2 years ago, I was elected to be the member of parliament for the city of Halifax.
At first glance, it might not seem that national policy is really connected with cities, but in fact, what happens in our cities affects national politics, and in turn, national politics affects what happens in our cities. Here in Canada, cities generate over 70% of the country's national GDP. Additionally, over 80% of Canadians live in urban areas, and globally, over half of the world lives in cities. In this episode, Andy and I talk about why urban planning is an important profession that's going to help save the world, the Canadian National Housing Strategy, a 10-year, $40 billion strategy that was announced by the Liberal government in late 2017, why investing in infrastructure is essential, even though it's not a terribly sexy topic, and how citizens can get involved in political decision-making. I'm curious if you can briefly talk about the journey that took you from an urban planner, urban designer, to here on Parliament Hill.
It's been a fascinating ride, I have to say. So I started out, I thought I was going to be an engineer, but then I got distracted by architecture. Then when I was studying architecture, I took a studio course about city planning. And then I thought, you can do more than just building sites and buildings. You can actually impact whole communities and whole cities. So I did a sharp turn and left architecture and got into city planning instead. And from that perch, have worked in suburban and rural communities, urban communities. I've worked in public and private sector. I've spent time in the academic sector. But one thing that definitely draws me to communities and community building is just that, the act of community building and the power of smart public policy and the impact that it can have on the quality of people's lives, their happiness, also their health and the health of the environment, on the fundamental sustainability of a city or of a community. City planning and community design can show us how cities and communities can do so much more with so less energy, less materials, less environmental degradation, all the while lowering GHG emissions and really making our lives more productive and happier. You can tell I'm kind of pro-planner. I love the profession, and it's worth noting 2 years ago, Canadian Business Magazine, in their annual rankings of jobs in Canada, ranked urban planner number 2 in terms of compensation and, more importantly, job satisfaction and upward mobility.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I firmly
missed that.
Yeah, that's a good one. So I just had the pleasure of spending a day at Queen's University School of Urban and Regional Planning, and I told them what I often tell young planners: that profession, I believe, is the one more than any other that's going to save the world. And I commend anybody who goes into it.
Wonderful. So as a fellow urban planner, I'm curious, we were just talking about how it's been just over 2 years now that you've been a member of parliament. What's that been like, shifting from urban planning is obviously always very place-based and specific location-focused, and of course you're representing Halifax in parliament, but you're with the federal government. So what's that been like as a transition in terms of your career, the work you do, and what you kind of focus on day to day?
Well, I mentioned a moment ago that my transition from planner to elected official was really rooted in what the potential of good, smart, thoughtful public policy can be, what the impact can be. And I saw firsthand when I was working at the city of Halifax, for example, how working with an incredible staff team and a wildly talented group of volunteer committee, the Urban Design Task Force, we really in 5 years transformed the fortunes of downtown Halifax from kind of a forgotten, deteriorating urban core that was attracting only about 16% of residential growth to a city that's in a renaissance right now, attracting nearly 50% of residential growth in the region. So it really is a story about what the right public policy upstream and the impact it can have on people's lives downstream. So I bring that with me here. And I see being an MP as part of a government who is so focused on infrastructure, on housing, on transit, on housing as a human right, emerging more and more so, especially under the new national housing strategy, that there is tremendous opportunity to create impact in Canadians' lives every day through good public policy. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
So Canada is huge. It's second largest country in the world, known for its wilderness and those kinds of things. Why are cities important to a country like Canada?
Well, there are philosophical reasons why, like, for example, cities tend to be the place where a great deal of our democracy happens, where there's interchange between people, between cultures, where businesses start, where languages are learned, where ideas and innovation are born, where immigrants tend to gather and become, in Canada, become new Canadians. But there's more than that as well. You know, as a planner, you know well that when humans are living close to each other, when humans live close to where they work or close to where they go to school, we're having a much lighter impact, a much lighter footprint on the earth. So cities and communities have the ability to have us living in close proximity, where we can walk to the grocery store, walk to school, where we can use less energy, as I've mentioned. Essentially, an enormous step towards solving the problem of climate change and sea level rise lies in our cities.
Right. So from when you get all those people living and working and moving around so close to one another, challenges obviously emerge. From a national perspective, what are some of the most important urban issues that your government is trying to solve?
Transit and housing, I think, are at the top of that list for sure. And I'll put housing at the very top. You've by now heard about the National Housing Strategy. It's a 10-year, $40 billion strategy that aims to build about 100,000 new housing units over the next 10 years. It aims to refurbish about 300,000 housing units over the next 10 years. It wants to reduce chronic homelessness in the country by 50%. It wants to remove about 500,000 households from core housing need. So this is transformational, and at the heart of that massive investment in housing is this idea that housing becomes a human right. So one element of the National Housing Strategy is something called the Canada Housing Benefit. And it's a monthly benefit that would accrue to an individual or a family. In the case of the individual or person in the most need, it would be around $2,500 a year. And what's very unique about this is that $2,500 doesn't adhere to a unit or a house or an apartment. It stays with the person. And so that's how we start to get into, this is actually about a human rights-based approach. If that person has to move because of health or family or employment opportunities, well, then that benefit travels with them wherever they may be, irrespective of the actual unit. So in other words, the person is helped. The unit is not subsidized.
And so it's been decades since the federal government has had a significant role to play in housing. It's been increasingly left to local governments in the market. What conditions, what realities did your government see to take this pretty significant investment?
Well, it grows from two things. One is listening to MPs like me who represent urban ridings or community ridings where there is housing need, and we were fortunate to have a government that pays attention and incorporates what it hears from its elected members into their policy approaches. But more importantly, the Canadian government has spoken directly to municipalities in this. So this is fundamentally, and again, this will resonate with people with an urban planning background. It's fundamentally based on engagement, consultation with the level of government, the order of government, where the rubber really meets the road. I hate to use car analogies, so let's say where the real change happens. Let's say that instead. Which is in communities. So working with the FCM, working with mayors, working with local councils, we have determined that what the elements of the national housing strategy should be, because nobody knows better than the municipalities themselves what those local needs are.
Right, and so can you talk about the kinds of folks that this will help the most that you think? Obviously, if it's a human right, it's everybody's right, but your initiatives have specific streams of activity. Can you maybe talk about some of those folks that this is intended to help most?
Yeah, it's absolutely intended to help those in the most acute need. So let's think about seniors, women and kids or families fleeing domestic violence, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, people dealing with mental health and addiction issues, veterans, young adults who can't stay at home any longer for a variety of reasons, who are out in the world, maybe living hard on the street. This is really aimed at those groups primarily, but the position of the government overall, in fact, really the core premise of this entire tenure is about helping, and this will sound familiar to you, but helping the middle class and people who are working hard to join the middle class. So it's not just the people in acute need, it's also about helping families who are looking to maybe upgrade from a rental unit into some sort of an owned situation, an owned tenure, a starter home or a condominium, to start to build equity and capital and climb up the ladder of housing in the country. So there really is something for folks who are getting by in this as well, but it is primarily for those in the most acute, immediate need.
Right. Okay. And that's one thing I've talked with a lot of folks over the years about the distinction between the market, and market housing serves a certain amount of folks, and then there's always been this large gap. So it's encouraging to see that there's that gap is being filled, and that if you take sort of a global picture of our cities, that should make our cities a lot more livable for everybody, which of course is the intent, not just folks that can afford to play in parts of the market in our cities.
Exactly. And, there's an interesting story playing out I'll talk about Halifax because it's the city that I know the best, but an interesting story playing out in Halifax right now. About 20 years ago, maybe it's 25 years ago now, our city amalgamated. Halifax, Dartmouth, Bedford, and the county of Halifax became one municipal unit. That was popular at the time. Toronto did it, became the GTA, and there were other examples as well. And one of the things that happened during that amalgamation is that the city gave up its administrative authority and function over the provision of subsidized and public housing to the province. So the province took over that role, and then the city in exchange took on maintenance and operations of all the provincial roads within the city. So they call it the service swap. Yeah. So it was meant to be equitable and all that kind of thing. But the unfortunate side effect of it was, we've touched on it already, is that it took the provision of that very direct service out of the order of government best suited to deliver it, which is the municipal frontline level. So what's happening in Halifax now is there is a really rich conversation happening at the city council about bringing that responsibility for housing back to the municipal level, which I think is a great idea. So I think in any community where we can put the municipality on the front line of housing along with those other frontline services is a really good move.
Right. And so with the National Housing Strategy, does that you talked about it going directly to individuals and families, which seems like a really efficient way to move people into better housing. Is there direct funds going to municipalities?
So that's for sure what we need to do. Like the kind of the most common model is that the provinces are in the position. So we have said that in order to unlock a certain portion of the money, basically the strategy. It's a strategy because it's made up of numerous programs together forming a strategy.
Right.
The various elements of the strategy do require the province to come to the table with a contribution for a housing project that the federal government will then meet. The question about what happens with municipalities is a really good one. And I think that's going to evolve as we go through the bilateral agreements between the federal government and the provincial governments over the coming year or year and a half or so, as we iron out all these details. The strategy acknowledges the sort of the primacy of the municipal level of government in providing this service, and that'll be reflected in those agreements. What that looks like will vary regionally. Communities across the country vary widely in their needs and their geographical characteristics or their environmental characteristics, their demographic characteristics. So there will be a kind of a customization of that approach as we go.
Okay, great. Yeah. So the other piece that you spoke about earlier, in addition to housing, was infrastructure. Why is infrastructure important to cities, and what role do you think federal governments can and should play?
Infrastructure, for the most part, is not very glamorous. Some of it can be. We have a beautiful new piece of cultural infrastructure in downtown Halifax, our award-winning Central Public Library, which is turning heads around the world. But that's a rare example of exciting infrastructure. It more often tends to be things that we take for granted but don't really think about every day. As you know, pipes and wires and things underground, services that we don't really see or find that interesting maybe in our day-to-day lives until they break, until they stop working, and then we're very aware of when the water doesn't turn on, when we turn the faucet, or if the storm drains aren't taking away the slushy water in a winter storm. So what we have learned from our colleagues at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, FCM, again, because it's the municipalities that are on the front lines here, is that the majority of Canada's community infrastructure gets a failing grade right now. It is the FCM released a report about a year and a half ago that has largely influenced the government's infrastructure spending plan. We are really sitting on a kind of a ticking time bomb of unfunded infrastructure deferred maintenance. So what is the right thing to do here? You might recall that this government was elected in part on a promise that differentiated it from other parties, which was, we're going to do deficit spending to invest in community infrastructure. And I believe that's really one of the main, if not probably the main reason why Canadians chose this party to lead rather than the others, who were promising balanced budgets and not much infrastructure investment. We can't have an economy without infrastructure that works. We can't expect the economy to work for our kids and grandkids when they come of age if we leave them cities and communities that are broken, that don't function. And as difficult as it may be sometimes for us to imagine deficit spending and increasing the national deficit, just imagine the cost it would be if we didn't invest in this infrastructure, if we allowed it to fail. The cost of kickstarting or restarting our communities would be astronomical and out of reach, I'm afraid, for future generations. So I feel strongly that we are engaging in a moral imperative right now to rescue our cities and communities with levels of infrastructure investment that really are unparalleled since FDR's New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which was a massive spending campaign in the United States to get out of the Great Depression. And it worked gangbusters, and we're seeing the same kind of impact so far in our infrastructure spending here.
And I know that cities around Canada and around the world are that kind of issue of the ticking time bomb doesn't get a lot of headlines because a lot of things haven't broken yet, but that's a fundamental driver for the conversation between, do our cities grow out versus up, regardless of where you are in the world, because that infrastructure, Cape Town and their water is one recent one, but that's really something that doesn't get talked a lot about, because it doesn't get talked about, like you say, until something's broken. So if something's about to break, you still don't talk about it. That's
right. We built our, I'm going to go back to Halifax for a minute. We built our downtown plan on this premise that infrastructure is expensive. We acknowledge that, But the way you pay for infrastructure is through tax revenues. And the place that tax revenues are kind of the most lucrative, where you earn the most tax revenues, are areas of density where many people are living. So it's fundamentally a question of economics that we should really be investing in infrastructure in areas where people already live, which is our existing communities and urban cores, rather than venturing off into forests and farms, building brand new, very expensive infrastructure in new areas that tend to be sparsely populated, sparsely settled, requiring very expensive services to maintain them. So a simple example would be if you have a mile of roadway in a rural area with 3 houses on it. Imagine the property tax revenues paying for that stretch of road, fire, ambulance, school, snow clearing, garbage collection. 3 houses are paying for a mile. Whereas in an urban core, you might have in a mile, you might have thousands of residential units that are contributing to that. So our salvation really, in terms of being able to afford to run our cities in the future, and our salvation in terms of living sustainably and with using less energy and less resources, lies in cities, living close together, which, by the way, has a huge host of other benefits like walkable lives or healthier lives. It's an antidote to social isolation. It helps small businesses because people are living close by their businesses in mixed-use, walkable neighborhoods. So every indicator tells us, from health to happiness to economy to environment, this is the right thing to do. Invest in cities, invest in communities.
Terrific. And the challenge of making infrastructure sexy is that's a big one. And like you say, people don't talk about it. I had a great conversation many years ago now with a civil engineer, and he said the great blessing and the great curse of modern cities is you can flush a toilet and not have to worry about what happens to that.
Yeah.
So it means your life is a lot better and cleaner and all that good stuff, but then you don't have to think about it, so you don't understand what happens.
You're not accountable for what happens at the other end of that pipe. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So it's my favorite quote from a civil engineer, probably my only one. Sorry about that. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to chat with you about was your role currently as the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Democratic Institutions. So what's your take on how democratic institutions are serving or failing our cities?
Well, I made the connection when we started out to say that cities are the places where democracy happens, by and large. So let's just make it very real here for a minute. When we have marginalized communities that have trouble casting a ballot, whether it's because they are fearful to enter a polling place for any number of reasons or lived experiences they may have had, whether it's because a driver's license costs $180 to get in a lot of Canadian cities, and a lot of people don't have $180. So how do they provide ID? If it's, and it doesn't have to be cities, we can go into remote communities too. If people can't get to a polling place because there's not an adequate public transit system to get them there, well, then we have a problem with our democratic institutions. And the Minister Karina Gould and I are focused through the Prime Minister's mandate to her on removing those barriers, making sure that as many, if not all, in a perfect world, eligible Canadian voters get to the polls and have the tools they need to make an informed and responsible choice once they get there. And what does that mean? I'm referring to the education mandate of Elections Canada, which was stripped out in a previous government, and we're returning. So that'll have an impact on school curricula, so that high school and junior high students will better understand what Canadian democracy is and how it runs. It also includes the creation of a political leaders debates commission, which we're engaged in right now. In fact, I just spent a week holding roundtables across the country, as did the minister, so that Canadians can hear from party leaders, so that they can hear what the party positions are on a number of issues, so that they can make that informed decision. So we really are working hard to give Canadian voters the tools and the knowledge they need to get into that ballot box and make a good choice.
Terrific. And that's obviously critical for our democracy to work in the electoral cycles. What are your thoughts in how we can improve our democratic conversations and dialogues in between elections?
Well, I'm so glad you raised that. So in Canada, we generally have an election once every 4 years. And being a good citizen is far more than casting a ballot one day every 4 years. Right. It's about everything that comes in between as well. So whether it's volunteer work in the community, whether it's working for or spending time with a civil society organization, just finding ways to help people and to contribute to discourse in your community. You and I are planners, so I certainly have, I'm sure you have too, spent a lot of time trying to get community members out to council meetings so that they can have their say, or getting folks out to a town hall meeting about a proposed change to a planning rule or a new development coming along the way. So anything that we can do to get people involved in the decisions that impact their lives on a day-to-day basis in our cities and communities is going to be time well spent and very important. One of the things I've also been working on is youth engagement in my role as the parliamentary secretary. And I held a series of fascinating roundtables last year in a number of Canadian cities with youth groups, Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, YMCA, YWCA. I shouldn't even list because I'll forget, I'll miss somebody, and I don't want to offend anybody. But the questions I was asking were, I was speaking to rooms full of engaged youth, 14 to 20 years old, more or less. And my question was, why are you here? Why did you even come to this discussion today? And I want to know the answer to that, because I would like to be able to transfer that in some way to the folks who aren't here. And, there's something obviously that called you into to be here today. It's something that called you to run for your students' council, something that called you to be a day camp counselor or an after-school supervisor. So that's good youth citizenship as well that we're trying to foster, which is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, so it's a habit by the time they hit adulthood.
It is, and specifically maybe to bring it back to the voting, voting is a habit that is formed very early. People who vote for the first time at the first age that they're eligible to vote, so in other words, 18-year-olds who vote when they're 18, statistically overwhelmingly become lifelong voters. So
is that right?
Yeah, wow. So we're very focused on one idea that the chief electoral officer is asking us to pursue, which we are doggedly, is the creation of a registry of youth voters. The idea being that we would get 14 to 17-year-olds pre-registered to vote, so that when they turned 18, they would automatically be added to the roll of electors. They'd automatically get their voter information in the mail at the next election. Whereas today, it takes a proactive act for that to happen.
Right.
And a lot of people get lost right there.
Right. So that reminds me of there's a study and I think a related TED Talk about I think it was organ donors in Europe, where the difference between vote in versus opt out. And obviously, the vast majority said, yeah, I'm all for this. But if they had to opt in, there was a way lower.
That's a really great analog. Yeah, that's fantastic. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. It will be an opt out situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Make it remove barriers.
Default
at all chance.
Exactly.
Yeah. Terrific. So one other question I was curious about in your new role as a member of Parliament. Have there been any surprising similarities that you found with other MPs that represent some of the larger cities in the country that maybe you didn't anticipate when you started the job 2 years ago?
Any surprise? There have been many similarities, or have any of them been surprising? I've got friends that are MPs that represent communities where even though these MPs don't come from a planning or community building background, I'm thinking of one in particular who's taken on bike paths and cycling, a cyclable city, a biking city, as a passion that she's engaged in and very successfully. There are others that are engaged in more sort of climate change and resilient infrastructure kind of conversations in their communities. But has there been anything that's been a real surprise? Maybe I would say I would answer this way. I have been pleasantly surprised by how many colleagues from very different backgrounds understand fundamentally the importance of our communities and investing in them. So I feel a little bit, I'll tell this little story. In my first speech in the House of Commons after I was elected, first speeches are called maiden speeches. It's an old tradition for whatever reason. In my maiden speech, I made sure that I said, I made sure that my colleagues knew my background, and I said, you'll get used to hearing me talk about cities and communities, and by now they certainly have. They certainly have gotten used to that. So in a way, as it turns out, the first and only planner elected to the Canadian House of Commons, I feel like I'm fomenting planners. I'm helping to train, planners amongst all my colleagues of all political stripes. And of course, doing that in the context of policy like we see emerging now with the National Housing Strategy and the $80 billion infrastructure investment is exactly the right time to be growing those sensibilities among parliamentarians.
Great. And that's it's really interesting and encouraging to see, because one of the premises of this podcast, as I was mentioning to you earlier, was that for folks like us that have chosen to make city building or community building our profession, we certainly feel like we can contribute, but there's folks, it doesn't matter what your background is, everyone can contribute. Yeah. And so that's really interesting to see from a parliamentarian perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the one last question I'll have is a question we ask all our guests. I know as a good urbanist, you've been to lots of cities around the world, but we'll just ask you to choose one. Can you tell me about one city you love and why?
I had the great fortune to visit Malmo, Sweden, and it quite frankly changed my life. How bikeable that city is, how walkable it is, the quality of the architecture, the human-scaled architecture that has emerged of late. It was particularly memorable was the transformation of a marine industrial area where submarines of all things used to be built in an area called the Western Harbor, Malmo Western Harbor. That through a series of architectural design competitions has become an absolutely remarkable gem of a community where you can park your car somewhere if you need to, but it's really all about bikes and walking. And the architecture is just absolutely striking. This is so that experience combined with, seeing 14-story buildings built of wood, small communities that you could just imagine being anywhere in Canada, being run off of a district heating system that's burning pellets, that's from waste wood from the local forestry industry. It is just remarkable. So it changed me in so many ways, and I recommend highly anybody who wants to be inspired in the same way to visit Malmo, Sweden.
Terrific. That's when I go to a place, I often challenge myself to find one word to describe a place, which obviously never does a place justice. But I was only in Malmo for a day, and comfortable was the word that came out, because it was just, there was nothing, it's not New York or Barcelona and that total frantic vibrancy, but it's like you described, it's just so well designed that almost everything you do is just comfortable. Like you don't have to think about it, which was really, really cool.
And if I could add one thing, what particularly struck me about it is that it was a city that was in decline when its industry failed, which was shipbuilding and submarine building. And it was nearing the end, really. And it reinvented itself in the 70s and 80s. It picked itself up. It created a city university, Malmo University. It's become a center for tech innovation. It's a thriving cosmopolitan economy now. And they did that with the force of their will and by making smart choices for their community. And it was such an inspiration for us when we were doing our work in Halifax and trying to spur on a renaissance of our own. It's the story of a kind of a can-do story that can be instructive for so many communities. I'm going to plug the profession of city planning again, just the way, so we have nice bookends here. We started that way. Like I said at the beginning, I firmly believe that planning and urban design and architecture, these are professions that impact the way that people live every single day and impact the way that they experience their world. But also professions that impact humans' ability to continue to live on this world in a way that we don't exhaust every resource that we have, that we don't pollute every stream and ocean that we have. Living smarter, living better, living happier is the daily work of planners and architects and urban designers in Canada and around the world, and they do absolutely fantastic work on our behalf. And I can think of nearly no higher calling for someone to pursue than public service in the form of community building.
I really appreciate Andy's optimism. He has a glass half full approach about how urban planners and urbanists can help shape the future of the country. The former U.S. Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, famously quipped that all politics is local. And Andy is an example of someone who understands the importance of the local context and is helping to translate that knowledge to a national scale. 360 Degree City is created by the team at Intelligent Futures. To learn more about the work we do, you can go to intelligentfutures.ca. The music in this episode and in all our episodes is by Sound of Picture. If you like the podcast, please share it with someone that might be interested in seeing their own city from a different angle. We would love it if you subscribed and reviewed the podcast and would love to hear your feedback. If you have any suggestions for future guests or topics that you'd like us to cover, get in touch with us on our website or any of our social accounts. I'm John Lewis. Thanks for stopping by.